Mason Torres had barely peeled the lid off his lunch container when the nearest alien student gagged loudly, dramatically, like someone had set off a stink grenade in the middle of the cafeteria. "Is that volatile meat slurry?" hissed a pale blue Glarnak from across the table, recoiling so fast it tipped over its nutrient cube tray. Around him, conversation stalled. Heads some scaled, some stalk-eyed, turned toward Mason and his steaming bowl of homemade chili con carne like it was a live grenade. A Yilthar covered its olfactory vents with a study towel. Another student muttered, "Is he allowed to boil aggression compounds in here?" Mason stared at his lunch, then at the stunned half-circle of classmates backing away from him like he'd brought anthrax to a salad bar. For a moment, he considered quietly resealing the container, finding a utility closet to hide in, and just eating in peace. But then he thought of his abuela, who slow-cooked that chili with love, fire-roasted peppers, and the solemn fury of 5 generations of spice tolerance. So instead, Mason stabbed his spoon into the bowl, took a loud, defiant bite, and muttered through a mouthful, "You're all seriously missing out." Silence. The nearby Glarnak made a high-pitched whine like a tea kettle and scooted 2 more seats away. A Rilvac student angled its hearing stalks toward him, grimaced, and whispered something to its companion, who immediately activated a mild environmental shield around their lunch pod. Mason glanced at the empty seats, forming a widening ring around him. The chili, steaming and fragrant, didn't seem like a war crime to him. It was smoky, rich, with a balanced heat that lingered just enough to warm the chest. Pinto beans, slow-cooked beef, cumin, onion, fresh garlic, fire-roasted chilies, and just a touch of dark chocolate for depth. To Mason, it was comfort. Home. It was everything that helped him survive 10-hour xenogastronomy theory lectures where half the vocabulary wasn't even in Earth standard. But to the aliens around him, it might as well have been a thermonuclear scent bomb. His appetite faltered. He glanced toward the bin. The idea of dumping the chili now, in defeat, tasted worse than synthetic protein paste. He hadn't spent the last 3 nights rehydrating dried chilies in the dormitory communal cooker just to toss the result into a trash chute. Still, the sting of humiliation prickled at his ears. No one said anything directly rude, but the sidelong glances, the disgusted expressions, and 1 trillion who had visibly activated an olfactory nullifier, it all weighed on him. That was when he noticed one alien who hadn't moved away. It was a Zethari. Smaller than most of its kind, this one wore an assortment of learning badges clipped to a bandolier across its chest, including 2 marked for high academic curiosity and 1 for cultural risk engagement, a program that Mason had only vaguely heard about. Its thin head tilted to the side, forked tongue flicking intermittently as it leaned closer, not away. "I detect fermented legumes," the Zethari said, voice curious but cautious. "And mammalian protein?" Mason blinked, halfway through a second bite. Yeah, pinto beans and beef, with spices." "Spices? You mean aggressive flora-derived bioactives?" Mason paused. "I mean flavor." The Zethari's golden eyes narrowed slightly. "Explain." Mason wiped his mouth and straightened a little. "Okay, so chili con carne is a dish from Earth, specifically from the southwestern regions of North America. It's a stew. It's usually made with slow-cooked beef, beans, tomatoes, chilies, and spices like cumin and paprika." The Zethari sniffed again, nostrils flaring. "There's a sharp, volatile compound. Burn taste?" "Capsaicin. From the chiles. It's spicy, but not dangerous, at least not to me." Mason hesitated. "I've heard it can trigger reactions in some other species, such as projectile sweating, auditory blooming, and emotional color flashes," the Zethari said calmly. "However, I am genetically tolerant to most Solanaceae-related irritants." "You want to try it?" The Zethari paused. Several nearby students, who had previously begun to filter back toward their tables, leaned in again, expressions ranging from horrified to captivated. "I will require a small sample," the Zethari declared, retrieving a personal test implement resembling a silver tuning fork. It scooped a tiny portion of chili, held it aloft, then touched it to its tongue. Mason waited. The Zethari froze. For one long second, it remained absolutely still. Then its neck frill shot upward in a burst of cobalt blue. "This is complex," it whispered. Mason tilted his head. "Good complex or bad complex?" "I require more." Without ceremony, it took a proper spoonful and shoveled it into its mouth. Then another. 3 more aliens, 2 Rilvac and 1 leafy-coated Telleran, edged closer. One of the Rilvac was already pulling up a datapad. "What compound is causing the chemical euphoria expression?" "It is the synergy," the Zathari declared between bites. "The convergence of multiple bioactives. There is umami. There is combustion. There is a nostalgia vector?" "That'd be the chocolate," Mason said, watching in amazement as his half-eaten lunch became the center of the room again, but this time, not with fear. "Is it safe for Telleran digestion?" the leafy one asked. "Capsaicin can irritate Telleran chlorocysts," someone warned. "I have protective enzymes," the Telleran shot back, already dipping a finger in. Within minutes, a half-dozen aliens surrounded Mason's table, asking about ingredients, measurements, and temperature profiles. A floating drone from the school's cultural engagement department hovered near the ceiling, blinking a red recording light. Someone asked for the recipe. Someone else asked what cumin was. "I can't describe it. You just have to smell it," Mason said, fishing the spice jar from his backpack. One sniff, and the Rilvac dropped its datapad in reverence. "I have transcended flavor," it mumbled. One of the Glarnak cautiously drifted back into orbit. "Wasn't this supposed to be toxic?" "For some, maybe," Mason said. "That's why we don't serve it at orientation." A small, frilly creature with no visible mouth asked, "Have you weaponized the umami?" Mason blinked. "No, but now I kinda want to." A murmur rippled through the growing crowd. The cafeteria's AI assistant beeped overhead. "Please be advised, spice tolerance varies by species. Medical responders are on standby." As if on cue, a Frelkin student staggered away from the crowd and sat down heavily. Its bioluminescent skin flashed red, green, red. "Oh no," someone said. "Is that an allergy signal?" Mason stood up fast, heart jumping. "Wait, what did they eat?" "Just 1 bite," the Telleran said, "of the part with the jalapeno." A medic drone zoomed in, scanned the Frelkin, and spoke. "Mild histamine reaction. Symptoms include flushed photophores and increased mucosal activity. Treatment in progress." The alien emitted a wet burble and slumped, but gave a thumbs-up equivalent. "Maybe." "We slow down," Mason said, concern clear in his voice. "Some of these ingredients can cause reactions if you're not used to them. We don't want anyone getting seriously hurt over lunch." That seemed to sober the group. A few aliens backed away to check compatibility data on their health monitors. But the Zetari stayed. "I want to learn how to make it," it said. "Me too," murmured the Telleran. "Does it always cause the sensation of hugging?" asked the Rilvac. Mason stared. "What?" "My torso is experiencing a memory of maternal safety." "That's just the cumin." The Rilvac let out a long sigh, as if it had just learned the meaning of life. By the end of the lunch period, Mason had no chili left. In its place was a dozen sign-up requests for a cooking demonstration, 3 unofficial club invites, and 1 inquiry from the Academy's Xeno-Diplomatic Culinary Wing. He slumped in his seat, dazed. What had just happened? The Glarnak returned, hesitantly. It took a small breath, still wincing at the residual spice in the air. "Do you have more tomorrow?" it asked. Mason blinked at it, then nodded slowly. "Next week," he said, voice tired but firm. "I'm making cornbread." The Glarnak looked wary, but it didn't walk away. Not this time. By the time Mason stepped into the culinary integration lab the next morning, there was already a line outside. He slowed mid-step. What the hell? Zethari, Glarnak, Rilvac, a couple of humans from the engineering annex. And was that an envoy from the sequestered Aklari collective? Yes. Wearing a respiration shroud and holding a clipboard. Mason instinctively tightened his grip on the grocery satchel in his arms. It had been less than 20 hours since his chili incident turned into an impromptu diplomatic tasting event. He had expected curiosity, maybe a couple of classmates poking their heads in. He had not expected a dozen eager-eyed multi-species attendees waiting outside Lab 7 like it was Black Friday, and he was handing out gold-plated replicator keys. He scanned the group, wary. Some held datapads, others clutched notebooks. The Glarnak was wearing gloves, possibly for safety. A Tellerin had brought their own anti-inflammatory decoction flask. Zrix, the Zathari from yesterday, was already inside, moving 3 modular prep tables together and adjusting the room's ambient moisture settings with a familiarity that told Mason this wasn't his first workshop. "Morning," Mason said as the door shut behind him. "You're late," Zrix said, not unkindly. "We have 37 confirmed participants, 5 pending. I have rerouted the ventilation system to compensate for potential airborne spice particulates." Mason dropped his satchel onto the prep table, groaning. "I thought this was going to be 6 people and a maybe." "You have started a cultural awakening," Zrix replied. Mason opened the satchel, revealing bags of beans, a spice rack, and a vacuum-sealed pack of beef he'd barely convinced the logistics department to classify as academic material. He pulled out the items one by one, arranging them for display. "This awakening's gonna eat me alive." Zrix's tongue flicked. "Then it will be well seasoned." By midday, the room buzzed with a controlled frenzy. Each table was equipped with a hot plate, a set of sterilizable utensils, sample ingredients, and a datasheet explaining the human Scoville heat scale. Mason had reworked his grandmother's chili recipe for safety. No ghost peppers, no jalapenos unless requested, and a mandatory compatibility test for any participant with mucosal membrane exposure risks. The Aklari envoy had requested a sealed observation dome and a filtered sample for analysis. Mason made a separate batch just for them, without meat and using a bean derivative that mimicked the original flavor sort of. It didn't quite hit the mark, but the envoy had jotted down notes with unnerving enthusiasm and mentioned a possible trade vector for legume imports. By the 3rd hour, things got heated literally. "Fire!" someone shrieked. Mason whirled around, already pulling the safety blanket from the wall mount. But it wasn't fire. It was a Glarnak emitting steam from its cranial vents, waving a spoon in the air. "I like it," the Glarnak declared, voice muffled by sheer ecstasy. "But also pain. What is happening?" "That's the capsaicin activating your nociceptors," Mason said, approaching cautiously. "Do you feel pressure in your cranial node?" "Yes, but I am emotionally stabilized. Is this a paradox?" "Kind of. Keep breathing." Mason handed the Glarnak a neutralizing yogurt packet designed for interspecies use. It gurgled happily and downed it like a shot. 2 lab assistants, 1 Tellerin, 1 human dashed past carrying cumin samples toward the smell analysis station Zrix had set up in the corner. Mason tried not to panic as he spotted one of the Rilvac manually measuring paprika ratios with the solemn precision of a chemical weapons expert. Then the Frelkin student from the day before wandered in again. "Wait," Mason called, moving fast. "Didn't you have a mild reaction yesterday?" The Frelkin nodded, photophores cycling slowly between teal and orange. "I have taken antihistamines. I wish to test if exposure builds resistance." "That's not how histamines work." "I am willing to suffer for science." Mason sighed. "Okay, small bite, and don't mix it with the habanero." By the end of the session, 6 minor medical interventions had occurred. 1 student had a nasal flare reaction from inhaling cumin dust too deeply. Another mistook the dried chili flakes for flavor garnish and had to be treated for oral irritation. A Yilthar mistook the rich, smoky scent for a mating signal and confusedly proposed to 3 classmates before realizing the sensory error. Still, not a single participant left unhappy. "Can I request more of the burnt bean paste?" the Glarnak asked, gesturing toward the bottom of Mason's chili pot. "You mean the chili itself?" "Yes, that." Mason wiped sweat from his forehead. "Sure, but next time we're doing a controlled batch, and no back-to-back tastings without allergy screening." Zrix handed him a data slate. "A number of students have asked for weekly instruction. I propose a cross-species flavor diplomacy initiative." "You what?" "Flavor diplomacy. Cultural empathy via shared culinary experience. It is a sub-program in the Academy's Social Cohesion Division, very underfunded." Mason blinked. "And they'll fund it if I keep making chili?" Zrix flicked its tongue. You have no idea how many species are willing to renegotiate trade tariffs in exchange for reliable spice access. Mason leaned against the table. I just wanted lunch. You have started a movement. A new notification blinked on the room terminal. It was from Dr. Headley, head of Xenonutritional Studies. Subject: urgent, sample, request, flavor mechanism demonstration. Message: we observed the biometric responses during today's workshop via passive monitors. Several were unprecedented. If you are available, we'd like to study your cooking methodology directly. Also, do you have more of that cumin substance? Mason read it twice, then looked up, dumbfounded. Did I just become an interspecies research subject? Zrix gave him a light pat on the shoulder. Congratulations, you are now academically delicious. That evening, Mason sat alone in the back quad courtyard, finally eating a bowl of untouched chili he'd hidden before the workshop began. This one was made to his grandmother's original specs: smoked brisket, double pinto, roasted pasilla chiles, and against all advice, a touch of habanero oil. As the first spoonful hit his tongue, the warmth settled in his chest like a blanket from home. He thought about the Tellerin whose skin had turned gold from joy, the Rilvac who kept whispering to the cumin jar like it was sacred, the Aklari envoy quietly asking for shipping estimates on dried beans. And somewhere in that quiet moment, Mason smiled, not because he had impressed anyone, but because, for the first time since arriving at the academy, he didn't feel like a foreigner. He just felt human. Rooted. Real. He glanced down at his chili. Abuela, he said aloud, they're going to weaponize your cooking. He dug in. The next morning, Mason didn't even make it to the cafeteria. He was intercepted halfway by two student liaisons from the Academy's Department of Intercultural Integration, who flanked him with the urgency of people escorting an ambassador to a peace summit. Mr. Torres, said the taller one, a serious-faced human named Caleb, who always looked like he was 2 minutes away from submitting a grant proposal. You've been formally requested at a closed session of the Diplomatic Culinary Exchange. Mason blinked, clutching the thermal carrier with a new batch of chili. The what now? The DCE, said the second liaison, a Tellerin whose name tag read Emissary Assistant, Level 2. Her voice was calm, but carried the distinct tone of someone juggling 14 conflicting priorities. It's an interspecies forum designed to discuss the risks and benefits of food sharing between xenocultures. You were nominated by 3 species last night. Nominated for what? To represent Earth's culinary perspective in the upcoming flavor integration proposal hearing. You mean the chili hearing? The Tellerin hesitated. Yes. Before he could protest, Mason was whisked down a side corridor, through a biometric scanner, and into a meeting room so over-engineered it looked like a galactic courtroom. Circular seating, translation, drones hovering, environmental filters set to neutral arboreal, which smelled faintly of pine and burnt paper. At the center of the room was a large table with covered samples of his chili, each in its own allergen-safe capsule. A holographic screen displayed a rotating molecular breakdown of the dish's primary ingredients, currently zoomed in on the cumin compound. Is that necessary? Mason asked. One of the moderators, a squatoplary with 12 pupils and a fondness for redundant safety protocols, responded without turning. One of the samples briefly triggered a mating reflex in the Thrix sensory centers. We are investigating whether cumin has cross-species psychoaffective potential. Mason coughed. It's just spice. For you, maybe. A soft chime rang, and attendees filed in. Representatives from 7 species, including 2 he'd never seen before, took their seats. Zrix waved at him from the center-left bench, already surrounded by 3 data pads and what looked like a laser thermometer. Dr. Headley entered next, carrying a tray with tiny spoons and a look that said, I am here for science, and I will not be denied. Then came the surprise. A short, broad-shouldered alien with gray skin and ceremonial armor stepped inside, followed by a half-dozen aides. Their presence turned heads, even among the non-humans. Mason leaned towards Zrix. Who's the tank? That is Yarn Cool, a trade advisor from the Aklari High Table. They don't usually attend public forums. What are they doing here? Zrix flicked its tongue. The Aklari economy is entirely closed loop. They grow everything on planet, Imports are limited to non-consumables. If they're here, it means your chili breached containment protocols. I didn't send them a shipment. You sent them a hope. The moderator tapped a control, and the central hologram flickered to life. Session open. Subject: Flavor exchange, Earth origin, chili compound, subcategory, Torres variant. We will begin with safety assessments. Dr. Headley stood. Preliminary analysis indicates no biohazard risk when consumed in quantities under 100 grams. Known side effects include emotional disorientation, pleasant hallucinations, mild sweating, and a documented phenomenon among Rilvac subjects referred to as culinary nostalgia seizures. That only happened once, Mason muttered. The Thrick delegate, a long, segmented creature with optical ridges like a glistening centipede, raised a claw. The sample produced dreamlike imagery involving parental figures and warm texture environments. Was that intentional? No, Mason said honestly, but I can explain the ingredients. He stepped forward and took a deep breath. The chili is made with beef, pinto beans, roasted peppers, tomato, onion, garlic, cumin, and some other spices. It's slow cooked so the flavors deepen over time. It's not meant to be aggressive or weaponized. It's comfort food. The room shifted. Attendees leaned in. Comfort? Asked the Glarnak emissary, adjusting its translator. But it causes sensory volatility. Yes, Mason said. But so does crying when you're happy, or getting goosebumps from music. It's the same idea. The spice doesn't just add flavor, it adds feeling. The Aklari raised a heavy hand. We do not experience your emotions, but we tasted something. A familiarity that did not belong to us. Explain. Mason paused, then said carefully. Maybe it's because the recipe has history. My grandmother taught it to me. Her mother taught it to her. It's not just food, it's memory. That gets baked into the flavor. Even if you don't share the history, you can still feel the echo. A murmur passed through the crowd. The Thrick scribbled something onto its data surface with manic urgency. After several long seconds, the moderator turned to the Aklari. Do you wish to submit your assessment? Yarn Cool stood, his voice like rusted metal on stone. The chili is dangerous. It bypasses standard neural filters. We experience deep hunger after eating it. Our systems have not done that in generations. It destabilized our internal equilibrium. Mason's heart sank. Yarn Cool continued. We request a formal trade review for access to Earth origin, legumes, capsaicin, and this cumin molecule. Zerix's frill popped open in visible astonishment. You want to import it? Mason asked, baffled. Yes, said the Aklari, because it made us feel. The room burst into overlapping translations. The Telleran delegate burst into color, going briefly golden. Even the stoic moderator looked winded. The Bean Accord, whispered Zrix reverently. The what? You've initiated a cross-species food treaty. The name will be adapted, but for now, that's what everyone's calling it. The Bean Accord. Chili as a medium for emotion-driven trade relations. Mason sat down hard. I just wanted a hot lunch. 2 days later, the cafeteria installed a new food station with an engraved plaque reading, Human Spice Zone Flavor may trigger unscheduled euphoria. Mason didn't ask who designed it, but it featured a hologram of him holding a ladle like a torch. Chili Day became a weekly event. Every Thursday, Mason cooked alongside a rotating crew of volunteer assistants. The recipes were carefully logged, modified for cross-species safety, and served with information cards describing each spice's origin and emotional impact. The medical station was moved closer, just in case. One Glarnak assistant developed a passion for cornbread and proposed a sub-diplomacy group around maize. The Telleran founded a poetic culinary circle titled Flavors That Touch Memory. Someone from Earth's embassy quietly reached out about exporting spice packs to the Aklari under academic license. Zrix began designing an interspecies cookbook titled Capsaicin and Culture, A Flavor Evolution, with Mason listed as lead source organism. And Mason? He kept cooking, kept sharing stories about home, kept watching aliens taste something completely foreign and feel something familiar. Each bowl of chili was a bridge, and each spice a brick laid between cultures that once only tolerated each other at a polite distance. They no longer sat far from his meal. Now, they lined up for it. The fire suppression system went off at 9:42 a.m. Mason froze mid-stir as white mist rained from the ceiling vents, dousing the air with a fine cooling vapor that smelled faintly of eucalyptus and regret. A Telleran screamed. A Glarnak slipped on the damp floor and emitted a shrill warble. Someone yelled, "It's only paprika!" Mason dropped the ladle, rushed to the control panel near the wall, and slammed his ID badge into the override slot. Disable suppression culinary lab exemption code 47 Earth Chili. A red light blinked 3 times, then shut off with a reluctant bzzzt. The mist slowed, then stopped. Mason took a deep breath, wiped paprika residue off the touch screen, and muttered, "Okay, that's my fault. I should have warned them about the visual plume." Xerix appeared at his side, holding a datapad protected by a grease-slick cover. "You exceeded the Academy's airborne flavor density limit. That's not a real thing. It is now." Mason surveyed the chaos. Today's session, chili variations and regional fusion, an introductory practicum, had barely begun. 8 alien students stood around, sputtering burners, wide-eyed and damp. One Aclari assistant was still recording spice to emotion ratios, and in the corner, an Aplari was calibrating its respiration valve while frantically scribbling notes on how smoke can smell like a family reunion. It was only week 3 of the Human Spice Zone program. And already, Mason was beginning to lose track of how many cross-cultural incidents had been caused by his abuela's chili. There had been the incident with the Durali student who tried to deep-fry a whole cumin seed and declared it a sacred detonator. The time someone attempted to reverse-engineer the dish using protein algae and accidentally made a paste that caused romantic hallucinations in the Yilthar. And then there was the failed bean fermentation experiment that nearly collapsed a dormitory's waste filtration system. He'd even received a complaint last week from a group of cafeteria purists who insisted that the human cooking station was emotionally destabilizing their routine consumption patterns. To be fair, Mason had made a batch of extra hot chili just to prove a point. Still, the attention hadn't died down. If anything, it was growing. Requests poured in daily. To teach, to demonstrate, to explain why anyone would voluntarily ingest something that could trigger crying, sweating, and joy all at once. And somehow, impossibly, chili had become a symbol of flavor diplomacy, of emotional resonance, of the bizarre resilience of humans who found comfort in burning mouths and full stomachs. Today, though, something was different. He felt it as he ladled out a small portion of smoky, meat-rich red chili into a bowl and handed it to a Yilthar student, who received it with the reverence of someone being handed a holy relic. "May I feel something?" the student asked, voice hopeful. Mason smiled. "Only if you're lucky." That evening, Mason was summoned to the central auditorium. He assumed it was another debriefing on allergen safety, or the recent cumin storage incident, where someone had snuck into the spice cabinet and triggered a 72-hour insomnia loop. Instead, he found himself standing on stage under soft ambient lights, staring out at a packed crowd of students, professors, and even a few embassy representatives. Dr. Headley stood at the podium. "Tonight, we recognize a student whose unintentional contribution to interspecies understanding has led to 3 new elective courses, 2 independent research initiatives, and a record-breaking 284 emotional response data sets." The crowd laughed politely. Mason tried to disappear into his sweater. He did not come here to be a cultural ambassador. He came to study, to cook, and to hold on to something that reminded him of home. Dr. Headley looked at him. And in doing so, he reminded us all that home isn't just a place. It's a flavor, a feeling, a memory you can taste. There was applause. Mason accepted the plaque with shaking hands. It was simple, wood-backed, engraved in 3 languages. At the top it read, "Cultural Impact Award, Mason Torres. For services in flavor integration and emotional culinary enrichment." He held it awkwardly, unsure whether to bow or wave. So instead, he leaned into the mic and said, "I still don't know how to cook for trillion digestion without starting a small fire." The laughter that followed wasn't mocking, it was warm. 2 weeks later, Mason sat alone at his usual table in the cafeteria. No chili today, Just a quiet lunch, leftover cornbread, a tangy bean salad, and a cup of sweet earth tea. He watched as a pair of Glarnaks shared a small bowl of chili at the far table. Azithari explained to a group of Telleran how to bloom spices for deeper flavor, mimicking Mason's gestures with eerie accuracy. Even the Oplari, who once insisted that food was only for fuel, had developed a strange fondness for slow-cooked legumes, and now published flavor poems under a pseudonym. No one avoided sitting near him anymore. He thought back to that first day, the gags, the recoil, the whispered horror at aggression compounds. He'd nearly thrown the bowl away, but he hadn't. Instead, he'd taken a bite, held his ground, told a story. And somehow, that had been enough. Zrix appeared, holding a steaming bowl. "It is your grandmother's recipe?" the Zithari asked, eyes wide. "More or less," Mason said. "I had to swap the beef for mushroom protein. She'd haunt me for that." Zrix took a careful bite. Its neck frill shimmered violet. "I believe I love your grandmother." Mason smiled. "Get in line." He looked out at the cafeteria. There were still challenges ahead. He was still adapting recipes, still managing spice emergencies, still explaining why cinnamon did not belong in everything. But something had shifted. The Academy didn't just tolerate Earth cuisine anymore. It craved it. Mason leaned back in his chair, the sun slanting through the high windows. A message pinged on his datapad. A new request. The Aklari embassy wanted to begin negotiations for mass legume import. A memo from Dr. Headley followed, asking if Mason would consider helping design a flavor empathy curriculum. He closed both notifications. He'd respond tomorrow. For now, he finished his tea, watched his alien classmates laugh over spoonfuls of chili, and let himself rest. He'd already made history. And next week, he was making cornbread again. They'd been warned.